Wow. No pressure tonight as we continue the work of my dear friend Charles Brock. I've got board members that are here doing the evaluation of myself. We are recording the lecture. All of our team is here. Two former chairwomen, Dr. Judy Lynch and Mayor Joyce Savanki are both here. Whew. I have to put a disclaimer out there, folks. I am not a trained historian. I read histories for fun. And when Charlie and I were talking about the Roman Republic and about the decline of the Republic, he asked me if I would consider doing a lecture on it, and somehow I said yes. Last week I regretted that decision, by the way. I have a 5-month-old at home and 2 boys, and it's not a lot of time for reading, so I've been reading at work. So without further ado, let's talk about democracy. Why is this important? Well, I'm going to start by saying this. When democracies die, they don't revive in 3 years or 5 years or 10 years. From the fall of the Roman Republic, it took an additional 1,800 years for the hegemony to become a true democracy or a republic. It was not until the French Revolution and the Enlightenment period that we started talking about the ideals of democracy. So this is why we're doing this. We have to take it seriously. So, let's get it going. So how often do you think about Rome? This is a challenge that has been going all the way through social media lately of folks asking each other, how often do they think about Rome? Some people say they think about Rome quite often, almost every day. Some people say never. And I say, what Rome? Which Rome? Let's talk about that. Are we talking about the kingdom of Rome, which was around for about, well, you do the math, looks like 150 years? Are we talking about the Republic, which was around for 500 years or so? Are we talking about the Western Empire, the empire that followed the Republic, which itself lasted 500 years, starting with Augustus? Or are we talking about Byzantine Empire, the empire that was a continuation after they first started with 2 capitals, Rome and Constantinople, in today's Istanbul, and that empire itself continued for well over 1,000 years. Or are we talking about the Holy Roman Empire, which some might say was neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire? It was essentially a power in the Gaul, in today's France and Germany and so on, that was given the imperial title by the Catholic Church whenever it needed defending. That's a whole nother lecture. We don't have to get into that tonight. Or are we talking about Rome today? So, we are talking about these 4 maps. You have the Republic, which is in your upper left. That is what the height of the Republic looked like. Then we're talking about the Western Empire, or the Roman Empire, or the Augustus Empire, and that was at its height in 117 AD. I believe it's under Emperor Hadrian. And you can see that it occupied quite a bit of Europe. And then you have the Eastern Empire here, and that's how it looked like. They retreated from much of Europe and focused in North Africa and Asia Minor. And then you have the Holy Roman Empire, which was mostly a Western Europe thing. It's important to know that most people that I've been talking to think that Rome was a European power. That's not true. It was a Mediterranean power. It ruled much of the known world at that point, at its height. So we're going to talk about the kingdom a little bit, because it's important to set the stage. The kingdom of Rome began at the Tiber River and the Palatine Hill, because it was a place where this marketplace could be defended. And all of what we know about the kingdom comes from the Roman Republic historian Livy. And Livy was known to exaggerate things a little bit, because after all, his point was to glorify the Republic and diminish and scare people about what a dictatorship looks like. We know that they had 7 kings, starting with Romulus and ending with Tarquin the Proud. And what we know about Tarquin, he was a SOB. He was very corrupt. He was ruthless. He killed people. Anybody that challenged him was gone, including his own wife and his brother and the former king who had resigned his post. Livy says that Tarquin the Proud was the nephew of the 5th king, Priscus, right? Priscus. There we go. So it all came to a head in 509 BC when Tarquin the Proud's son raped a noble woman, Lucretia. And she thereafter committed suicide, according to Livy. Historians say that what Livy was talking about could have been a metaphor on how the people of Rome felt under the king. So as we make the transition from the kingdom to the republic, I wanted to get something out of the way because we just don't have the time tonight to get into the Roman political thought. But a lot of this stuff is going to seem familiar to you because, after all, our own republic was designed based on the Roman Republic. So here's how governmental structured, which was not always the thing we're talking about at its height. What did the government look like? And we will find out later that more and more people gained the power as time went on. And then there was a fight between the people that wanted more freedoms and the people that want to go to the back to the good old days, which brought the civil wars about. So let's talk about the government. The government structure consisted of 3 main branches: the Senate, the assemblies, and the magistrates. The Senate was made up of elderly statesmen or patricians who advised policy and administrations. The princeps senatus was the most powerful person in the Roman Republic. Extra point, who was the last princeps senatus? No. A guy by the name of Cicero. He was the last one. Magistrates were elected officials who executed laws and governed various aspects of society, the executive branch. Assemblies comprised of all Roman citizens where laws were proposed and voted upon. Each branch had the power to check the other, preventing the concentration of power. Magistrates could vote on each other's actions, and the Senate could override decisions made by the magistrates. Checks and balances. Consuls, the highest magistrate, serves as chief executives and military commanders. Praetors, in charge of administering justice and overseeing civic law. Censors were responsible for conducting censuses and maintaining public morality. And there were other officials like quaestors, sorry, it's the third language thing, who handled finances, and there were other officials that handled public works and religious affairs and so on and so forth. The legal system was based on laws known as the 12 tables, which were displayed in public to ensure transparency. Legal proceedings were conducted in public and included trials by jury. Citizens served in the military as part of their civic duty. Military leaders were often prominent politicians and were subject to civilian control. Society was divided into classes based on wealth and ancestry. Patricians, the aristocratic families with political influence. Those are known as patricians. The plebeians were the common citizens who eventually gained political rights and representation. Not at the beginning. Rome expanded its territory through conquest and colonization. Provinces were governed by Roman officials with local administrations handled by indigenous leaders or Roman appointees, the quaestors. How do we say that? Quaestors? Anyways. Provinces were governed by Roman officials. Roman citizenship was gradually extended to inhabitants of conquered territories. Civic virtue was emphasized the importance of civic duty, virtue, and sacrifice for the greater good of the republic. Leaders were expected to prioritize the well-being of the state over personal ambitions. Public service was highly esteemed, and military valor was celebrated. That'll come into play later as we talk about the wars. Citizens gathered in various assemblies to cast votes on legislative proposals, elected officials, and to decide important matters. Assemblies were open to all male Roman citizens, although voting power was often weighted based on the wealth or social status. In assemblies, they would organize people into classes. I believe there were 6 classes. And the people on the lower classes, the lowest class, which had the most amount of people, hardly ever voted. They only voted if an issue or a race was extremely close and they needed those votes. So if you were poor, you technically got to vote, but your vote was not as powerful as if you were in the wealthy classes. Voting in the assemblies was typically done by show of hands or by using voting tokens. Magistrates, including consuls, praetors, and other officials, were elected through a series of assemblies known as comitia. Candidates presented themselves to the electorate and campaigned for support. Voting took place through a series of ballots where citizens wrote the names of their preferred candidates. Women, slaves, and non-citizens were excluded from the voting process. Don't woo that. I mean, they were excluded from our voting process at the beginning, too. Voting typically occurred in open spaces such as the Roman Forum to allow large gatherings. Citizens were organized into voting groups based on respective tribes and districts. In some cases, secret ballots were used to protect voters from intimidation or influence. Initially, voting rights were limited to male Roman citizens of certain classes. Over time, plebeians gained voting rights and representation, and we'll get into that in a little bit. Quorums were required for assemblies to conduct business, ensuring decisions were made with sufficient participation. Some laws were proposed that were laws and proposal required specific levels of approval from different assemblies or voting bodies to pass. Think about majority, simple majority, veto-proof majority, supermajority. That's where that comes from in our own Constitution as we look at this. Candidates and political factions sought to garner support through promises, alliances, and appeals of interests of various voting groups. Election fraud, bribery, and other forms of misconduct was punishable offenses. Officials could face fines, expulsion from the office, or exile if they were found guilty of messing with the elections. Citizens were expected to engage in the political process, contribute to decision-making, and uphold the principles of the Republic through active participation in the elections. And with that, that sort of gives you a summary of what the system looked like. Obviously, just like with our own system, you can't cover that in the 5 or 7 minutes that I did here. So it's the procedures are very, very complex. We can get into that in another lecture. So let's get to the early part of the Republic. You see Lucius Junius Brutus there. If that sounds familiar, is because it should. He is the forefather of Brutus, who ends up organizing the assassination of Caesar later on. He was the one that led to the defeat of the king. And he was very persistent about it. The exiled king tried to make a comeback a few times after 509 BC. At one point, he brought in the 50 families that ruled until 495 BC. He was appointed co-consul with another person. I didn't put his name up there because he doesn't matter. But Brutus, essentially, there was a movement by the other council to bring the king back. And Brutus executes the other council and his 2 sons, and that was the end of the king. Again, what we know about this is through Livy. There's not much detail that they got into. So these 50 families ruled until about 494 BC. It was a republic run by the very elite. The plebeians only emerged in 470s and 80s BC because there was a famine. Turns out these families were no different than the king watching for the interests of the masses. So they sort of unionized themselves and would not serve in the military and would not work unless they were given rights to influence their day-to-day life. And we have this guy here, Cincinnatus. He's an important figure as a culture setter for the republic that followed. The Gallic tribes, which were in the north of Italy, actually more into Europe, they invaded the Italian peninsula, and they almost destroyed Rome. The Senate got together and decided to make Cincinnatus a dictator. See this whole thing of dictator for a day? They really flirted with this quite a bit. I don't agree, and this is why really martial law is frowned upon, because that was their version of martial law. So Cincinnatus is met at his farm. He's asked to come be dictator for life. For 6 months to defeat the Gallic tribes. He comes into Rome, raises an army, requires everybody to serve, and comes in, kicks the butts of the Gallic tribes, and then goes back to Rome. He could have made himself king. He did not. After 21 days of being the dictator, he resigns and goes back to his farm. He's brought in again as the commoners or the plebeians were organizing an uprising, and he's brought to basically put that fight out. He's made dictator for a short point in time, puts that uprising, goes back to his farm. So he is glorified in the Roman Republic. He actually set back the plebeians quite a bit because they were on the verge of getting some political power, but because of Cincinnatus, he sends them back quite a bit, and the plebeians, tribunes, were not put into power until 109 years after the Republic was formed. They were given the power. The plebeian assemblies were given a political position in the tribunes. One could only run 1 year, once, to be a tribune. That comes into play later. But tribunes, there were 10 of them, could veto the Senate, could veto the consuls. They had quite a bit of power. We have this dude right here, and I'm not even going to bother reading that name, but he was a patrician, a very wealthy patrician in the Roman Republic. He was a consul, and he aligned himself with the populace and promised to pay off their debts and trying to gain popular support. And the Senate stepped in and said, "Hey, that guy's trying to be a king." And so they gave him the death sentence and threw him off a building. So no talking about helping the masses in the beginning. But the fight continues. continues in the next 20 years or so. There were two tribunes, Licinio and Sextian, who basically got some laws passed through the plebeian assembly. And those laws basically restricted the land, how much land goes to the elites. And also, they advocated for the consulship to be open to the plebeians. Some sources say that was approved. If anybody knows that, let me know after the lecture. I couldn't really find it, but there's never been a consul that was a plebeian. But at any rate, things after that started doing pretty good. The Republic, there was as many people into the umbrella inclusivity as there was right after, these kind of things happened. People were happy. So they started fighting and, going to war with their neighboring cities and winning. And, in the next 100 years or so, this is what the Roman Republic looked like. They had essentially overtaken, from a small city of Rome, overtaken the entire Italian peninsula and Sicily, half of Sicily, or less than half of Sicily. But the major power at that point was the Carthaginian Empire. So they went to war in a series of 3 wars known as the Punic Wars. Why are they called the Punic Wars? Is because the people of Carthage were Phoenician. Phoenician was a power in the Middle East that grew and grew and had satellite cities all over the Mediterranean. So let's get into, what the heck is that? Hold on one second. Let me check my notes here. Let's talk a little bit about Carthage. Carthage was founded in 1814 BC as a Phoenician state. In 650 BC, which is before the Roman Republic, it became an independent state. It itself was a republic, although it was an oligarchic republic where money ruled the way. They would elect these elected magistrates, which really were 2 elected each year. They were sort of like judges or presidents or monarchs. They had a lot of power. They had supreme councils. They had smaller legislative offices for domestic affairs. One of the big differences between Carthage and Rome was that the politicians in Carthage did not really participate in war. They had professional generals to do that. So we have a republic which tied military experience and your political career together, and you had a republic that was run by politicians. And this comes into play because in all accounts, Carthage should have wiped Rome clean, and it almost did. All right, so what do we know about the Punic Wars? The first Punic War happened with Hamilcar Barca, who is the father of the name that we know as Hannibal Barca. He was the general leading the war. It lasted 23 years. 400,000 casualties, according to Polybius, were incurred, mostly in Sicily. Some historians say up to 1 million people died in this war in 23 years. But the politicians at home in Carthage were tired. Even though Barca had never lost a battle, they pulled his funding and ended the war, giving the Romans everything they wanted. Mr. Barca here does not like that decision. He takes his supporters, moves to the Spanish peninsula, Barcelona, anybody? And creates his own empire there, although it was tied to Carthaginian Empire. He takes his son, Hannibal, who makes him promise that he would never be a friend of Rome. So in 20 years, they worked, and Hannibal Barca grew up, and voila, the Second Punic War, or the Hannibalic War, or the war against Hannibal. This was, by far, the deadliest war in the ancient world. Rome could have been lost. But again, after Hannibal makes the trip over the Alps, he makes one mistake. He wins a huge battle and does not march into Rome. The second time that he could have chose to end the Republic, the politicians back home did not send him his reinforcement. As you can see, based on death tolls, 500,000 Italians died. A whole generation of Roman men were killed at the Battle of Cannae. 100,000 of them in a matter of 3 days. But he didn't finish the job. Rome rebuilt, brought in new people, gave new rights to folks to serve in the military, promised their slaves freedom if they served in the military, and eventually Scipio Africanus was able to succeed against Hannibal. He was later killed or fled, or we don't really know what happened, in Africa. So these are the major battles that happened in Rome. Most of them were won. In Italy, most of them were won by Hannibal. After the Second War and the Third War, this is what the empire looked like, or the Republic looked like. It blew up. It exploded. And one of the things that the Romans did was they gave a chance to different cities, different tribes. Hey, if you surrender willingly, you can just come into the fold of the Roman Republic. No big deal. But if you refuse, you and all of your people will be made into slaves. So the end of the Punic Wars is the beginning of the end of the Republic. And I'll tell you why. As I said, slavery exploded. Let's talk about it in numbers. In the Roman Republic itself, there were an estimated 5 million new slaves. 10 to 15% of the whole republic were slaves. 30 to 40% of the Italian peninsula were slaves. Up to 70% of the Roman city, of the city of Rome, were slaves. And 50% of all those slaves were owned by the 1.5% of the people. And just to break down, about 50% of the slaves were out working in the fields. and about 50% were in the cities. 250,000 slaves a year were being either bought or sold after the major rush of slaves. So as they were getting more conquered, about 250,000 of slaves were coming in a year. It's important to note that slavery was not a race-based slavery. In fact, most of the people that were slaves were not too far from where they were born, because they didn't want to deal with the whole thing of assimilating people into their culture. They wanted people that spoke the language and could do work. There were jobs assigned to slaves, about 55 of them. And most slaves were, as I said, indigenous to the area. Only about 1% were non-Europeans. So why does that matter? Well, in comes Tiberius Gracchus. Tiberius. We'll get to his brother later, Gaius Gracchus. He was known as the genuine patriot. He had a life of privilege. He was both of patrician descent and plebeian descent. His father was a rich plebeian, but still a plebeian. But his mother was the daughter of one of the most revered heroes in Roman history. So he was, by all accounts, lived a very privileged life. He was known as the first person to climb the wall in the Third Punic War as the Romans destroyed Carthage. He was sent back to the Spanish peninsula to basically put an uprising down, and he didn't have to do that. There was a treaty that was signed. He did it peacefully, and then wanted to come back home, and he took the long way. He basically went to the farms he went through all of the Roman peninsula, and what he saw truly disturbed him. What he saw were there were no more small farms in Rome. They were either abandoned completely, or folks were forcefully removed from their farms because of their debt. Big farms had taken over the Italian peninsula. Laborers in these big farms were slaves. He made a point that it was better to be a slave in the Roman Republic than it was to be a poor person. And here's why. As a slave, you were taught a skill. And you could actually arrange yourself to buy your freedom and then use that skill to get you out of poverty. And it happened many, many times. And he was completely upset because the lands that he saw were all public lands. He saw that the Lycian laws, which were passed a long time ago, more than a century and a half ago, were no longer being followed. That rich people were using fake names to get more and more and more land. And when he came back to Rome, he saw what was going on. He'd been in battle for so long and serving in the military, he didn't know what was going on in his own city. And what he saw was there were about 2,000 people in the city of Rome that lived in extreme luxury. The rest were poor, many of them former soldiers who abandoned their farms, and there were nearly 400,000 of them. This is A.H. Beasley, who studied the Gracchus brothers quite a bit. And this was his own analysis. Essentially, corruption, greed was overtaking the Republic, and something had to be done. So Tiberius wanted to get into politics. We remember that he was eligible to run as consul or as a tribune. But consul was for him to go through the Senate. And he didn't think that was going to do any good, because the Senate were the 2,000 people that he saw that were living a luxurious life. So he runs to become one of the tribunes. And his message was, what belongs to the people should be shared by the people. But the man who fought and died for Italy enjoyed nothing more but the air and light. Without house or a home, they wander about with their wives and children. Inequality, folks. So what did he want to do? He essentially was not really looking for anything that was too outrageous. He's like, let's just follow the laws that we have in our books. Let's get these rich people to get their share, which is 350 acres or 320 acres. And we will be actually extra nice, and we'll give them 150 acres per child that they have. And we'll pay them to forfeit the lands they stole. Oh, the Senate did not like this at all. They accused him of being anti-Roman and anti-capitalist, and they were able to get to one of the tribunes, a guy by the name of Octavius, to veto these laws that were being proposed by Gracchus. Gracchus said, we need to figure out a way around this. He organizes the assemblies, kicks Octavius out of the tribes, and passes the law. A tribune organizing the exit of another tribune had never been done before. So the laws passed, but the Senate ultimately had the purse. And they chose just to not fund it. So opportunity knocks a couple years down the road, or not even a year down the road. Attalus III ran a city in today's Greek, dies, and leaves a huge fortune to the people of Rome, to the Republic of Rome. And Gracchus said, why don't we use that money to fund the laws, instead of this money just going to the patricians? The Senate did not see this as a good thing, because tribunes and the people's assemblies were usually not involved in foreign affairs. Accused him of he's trying to be the king of Rome and get all the money that is being conquered into the hands of the tribunes. Tiberius then decides that he's going to run for one more year in election. Remember, that was forbidden by the Constitution. Another first. This infuriated the Senate. Went from being paranoid about Tiberius to basically organize the first mass killing in the Roman Republic. The senators literally using sticks, stones, and everything they could find, went to the assemblies, killed Tiberius and 300 of his followers, and threw them in the Tiber River. And many of his supporters, including his own family, were sent into exile or brutally executed. So what did this do? Well, it didn't take the problem away, that's for sure. Tiberius became into a martyr. The outrage in the city was so big that his reforms were passed by the Senate and made into law. And Gaius, his brother, is the other Tiberius that is even more radical, that comes in about 7 years later. He stayed away from Rome, but because of his Scipio Africanus bloodline, he was appointed to a quaestor in Sardinia, and became, using that sort of platform, he became one of the most brilliant speakers Rome had ever seen. And he came back to Rome. He decided that he was going to run, and won for as a tribune, started vetoing everything that the Senate wanted to do, and then he ran for re-election again. And this is what he said: "They slew him. Those scoundrels slew Tiberius, my noble brother. Ah, they are all of one pattern." He was essentially declaring war on the Senate. Well, again, the Senate did not take this lightly. So they organized the killing of Gaius Gracchus, and 9,000 plebeians with them. They cleansed the populist movement. They protected their wealth. A year later, this guy comes into scene, Marius the Great, who was himself both a patrician and a plebeian. So he could run for tribune or consul, and he does both. He was, unlike Gracchus, he was at top of his game in the military. He was Scipio the Younger, who organized the demolition of Carthage. He was his successor. So he had this respect of the military, and Senate was a little bit afraid of him because of that. He held a consul an unprecedented 7 times. He was elected first as tribune in 120 BC, and he immediately went back to align himself with what was left of the Gracchi brothers movement. But unlike the Gracchi brothers, the Senate was a little bit more afraid of Marius. Before we get into what Marius did, I do want to introduce Sulla, who is sort of his nemesis, right? He is a patrician who is from one of the most noble families in Roman Republic. But his family fell into poverty. Somewhere along the way, nobody's quite clear, a relative let him, died and left him a lot of money. And while working for Marius in the military, he had huge military success, particularly against Jugurtha, and became very famous himself. He never lost a battle. And these two, by most historians, are the folks that began the end of the Roman Republic. So let's talk about Marius' populism a little bit. He ran for consul. He basically was very much of a populist. He was annoyed by his co-consul and basically was telling him that he could beat Jakarta in 3 days. You know, the whole Putin speech there in 3 days. And with half the troops, he was really, really a populist person. He took the reforms to the next level. He wanted, he removed land ownership as a requirement to serve in the military. That was unheard of. Not even the Gracchi brothers could have imagined. The Gracchi brothers, the only thing they wanted was to expand land ownership to give more people the ability. He just said, forget about it. We're going to accept anybody, any citizen that wants to serve in the military can serve in the military. And this made him very popular. With all of that unemployment because of slavery, military recruitment skyrocketed. And he had promised anybody who serves that there would be land at the end of their term. His popularity was very much so as consul in the Senate, being elected 7 times. So what happens is there's a little tension between Sulla and Marius. Sulla was known as more of the conservative. The Senate preferred Sulla. So they essentially took his subordinate to raise the army to go into an uprising that was happening in Greece. So while Marius did not like this at all, so he went to the tribunes, to the people's assembly, and nullified that decision and essentially got himself appointed to go and put down this uprising. Sulla did not recognize the decisions made by the tribunes. He had a military outside of the city, 6 legions. He marches them into Rome, exiles Marius, and basically orders the death of anybody that was close to Marius, including Marius. But then, after that, he had to go to Greece to put on the uprising. Well, Marius did not let that opportunity slip by. So he went to Africa, raised raised an army, and then moved back to Rome, where he came and says, I'm going to take the gloves off. He kills a whole bunch of the conservatives. A whole bunch of them. The numbers aren't really there, but the prescriptions that become infamous with Mark Antony and Octavian and Lepidus in the Second Triumvirate really started with Marius. Right? But he came into Rome, appoints himself as consul, and then dies mysteriously 17 days later. Ooh, this news gets to Sulla, who comes back with vengeance. He is mad, folks. He is mad. He comes back, essentially wipes out the populist movement. He undoes everything the Gracchi and Marius brothers did. He limited the power of tribunes. Remember, he could not run to be a tribune, so he hated it. And if you ran for tribune, you could never serve in public office again after your 1-year term is done, and removed the veto power of the tribunes. He decided that he was going to double the Senate by giving the Roman representatives in all these republics a seat at the Senate. So the wealthy had even more power. And they were included because there was some sympathetic ears of the wealthy living outside of the Rome to basically have more and more power or have representation. He reversed all of the Gracchi reforms and then gave up his dictatorship, ran for consul, and won. Served the one term, and then retired away from Roman life with his wife and his long-term male lover. That's not me, that's Plutarch, okay? So, just putting it out there. And he dies, I think, 1 year after leaving. So what happens after Sulla? Well, the slaves had an uprising. They had 3 wars. This is the 3rd war. And this is the uprising of Spartacus. And this required all hands on deck. This is the 2nd time that Rome could have been destroyed if the slaves were a little bit more organized. So the wars against Spartacus brought back a lot of the folks that were sent into exile to fight against them. Pompey the Great had been made heir apparent by Sulla, so he was there to represent him. And there was a bitter rivalry between Pompey and Crassus because they were sort of equal with Sulla, but he chose Pompey and not Crassus, who was the richest person in Rome. I mean, he would make Elon Musk look poor. They ran and became co-consuls. Crassus was the one that led the defeat of Spartacus at the end of the day. And they really hated each other. They didn't like to work with each other whatsoever. So there was a huge division happening in the Roman Senate and in the Roman decision-making, but they were able to agree on a few things, like undoing some of the harsh things of the of Sulla. So a few years passed by, and by around 60 BC, Caesar had come into prominence as a military leader. There was an alliance that was made because nothing was being done in Rome at that point. You had people who supported Caesar, vetoing everything that the other 2 wanted. Pompey had control of the Senate. They were vetoing anything that Caesar wanted. Crassus could not get anything done. So they made an alliance, an informal alliance that worked with their factions to get their policies in place. You had Caesar, who wanted to conquest in Gaul and Britannia, but Senate would not fund it. You had Crassus, who wanted to invade modern-day Syria, which was known to have the biggest amount of wealth. Get it? Crassus money going together. And you had Pompey, who wanted to continue his conquest in North Africa. So they said, all right, let's come together, use our factions we can all get what we want. At any rate, these are just, I'm going to have to speed up a little bit here because we're getting towards the end of it. But their goals were to help each other out. The first triumvirate eventually dissolved because Crassus got killed in Syria. Kind of gruesome because he chased money. he got ambushed, was going in for to surrender, and the people of that tribe decided to dump a whole bunch of melted gold on his head, and then chopped his head and sent it back to Rome, leaving Pompey and Caesar in charge. And 4 years later, they crashed into another civil war, with Caesar winning. Pompey escapes to Egypt, where the boy king decides that Caesar might like the head of Pompey, and organizes that, sends it to Caesar. Caesar is baffled by it. That's how he picks Cleopatra to lead the Egyptian province. Long story short, Caesar appoints himself as dictator for life. Brutus has an issue with that, organizes his killing. Voila. Second triumvirate. And this triumvirate was more organized and informal. This was between Octavian, who was the nephew of Caesar, who inherited all his wealth. Mark Antony, who led the legions of Caesar. He was his heir apparent in the battlefield. And Lepidus, quite frankly, he was just around. Maybe they just decided to give him some power. Nobody knows what happened to Lepidus. But really, the fight for supremacy between Octavian and Mark Antony happened after they get everyone killed that played a role or not played a role through these massive proscriptions that basically killed Cicero as well during that point. They split the empire into three. Mark Antony went to Egypt, where he, the whole thing with Cleopatra. Octavian stayed home. And what he did at home was a whole propaganda against Mark Antony, that soon enough, if we don't do something about this guy, we are going to have to report to an Egyptian queen. So the Senate gives him all the money he needed to go and defeat Mark Antony. And then he becomes the sole person left. Now, by all accounts, Augustus was a pretty good leader. Rome bloomed. He sort of hid. He pulled a Putin, folks. He didn't want to tell the people of Rome, I am your dictator. No, he just ran and ran and ran and won and won and won. And got, he was in a council and then became a tribune as well. And then, the heck with Princeps Senatus, I'll become that guy too. Essentially, the power and more power concentrated to Augustus. He was named Augustus, which means commander-in-chief. Thereafter, and he ruled till 14 BC. So when you look at the development under Augustus and under the Roman Republic, it's the best life had ever been for a normal person. And some would say that the best form of government is monarchy, until you get Tiberius and Nero and Caligula and all of these not so nice emperors that basically destroyed everything that was accomplished by Augustus and by the Republic. So let's get some analysis here from folks on what happened. Why did the Roman Empire fail? Cicero said this, do not blame Caesar, blame the people of Rome, who have so enthusiastically acclaimed and adored him and rejoiced their loss of freedom and danced in his path and gave him a triumphant procession, blame the people who hail him when he speaks in the form of the new wonderful good society, which shall now be Rome, interpreted to mean more money, more ease, more security, more living fatly at the expense of the industrious. He also said, never was a government that was not composed of liars, malefactors, and thieves, which he said played a major role in the downfall of the Republic. What society does to its children, so its children do to society. He was really concerned about the lack of education around the democratic values. We didn't teach the youth about why there was a republic. And the youth, in turn, became their natural instincts. I won't read that one. This one is a good one. Times are bad, children no longer obey their parents, and everyone is writing a book. Now, that's a funny thing. But he saw the decline of respect for intellectualism. Everybody was smart. Everybody's opinion mattered. Today, everybody's got a podcast. I mean, really. I've listened to some of these people. I'm like, who gave you the air, for crying out loud? Sallust, who was a historian in the early parts of the Augustan age, basically summarized it. There was a moral decline. And you can read about that. Political instability. Military expansion. They grew too much. Social inequalities. The rich got richer, the poor got poorer. And the collapse of the Roman institutions, mostly as a result of Sulla and Marius conflicts. Juvenal was another Roman historian who essentially agrees with those premises. And the loss of virtue and values, that's a big one. I'd love to read all of that stuff, but I just don't have the time here. There is a book that I think everybody should get, is known, Are We Rome? By Colin Murphy, who is just a wonderful, wonderful writer. He essentially makes the point that Rome really didn't die. It just sort of got transferred to the Western Europe. The Republic got transferred into the Western Europe and then into the United States. And empire moved to places like Russia. That's what Tsar means, people. Tsar means Caesar. So Cicero and Caesar are still at war with each other, these two ideals. He compares the decline of the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire with contemporary events, as I said, explores similarities in political dynamics, social issues, and cultural developments between ancient Rome and modern America. It's very good stuff, folks. Examines the concept of imperial overreach and the challenges posed by maintaining vast territories and military commitments. Considers how excessive expansion and military contributions to the decline of both Rome and potentially modern superpowers like the United States. Erosion of Republican values discusses the erosion of Republican values, virtues, and the rise of authoritarian law. Okay, hold on. And political polarization highlights parallels between the concentration of power in the hands of the few elites in the ancient world and contemporary concerns about democracy and governance. Explores cultural shifts and societal changes that accompanied the decline of Rome, including moral decay, decadence, and the breakdown of traditional values. Draws parallels to contemporary cultural trends and debates surrounding morality, ethics, and social norms. Threats to civil liberties. He examines the erosion of civil liberties and individual rights at the time of crisis, such as during the period of war by appointing a dictator or dictators, one after another, and considers the parallel between historical infringements of civil liberties in Rome under the rule of Caesar and modern debates over surveillance, privacy, and government overreach. Discusses the role of hubris and arrogance in the downfall of great powers, including Rome. Don't be arrogant, folks. Considers how overconfidence, complacency, and a sense of invisibility can lead to catastrophic consequences both historically and in the world today. He argues for the importance of studying history and drawing lessons from the past to inform present-day decision-making. Encourages reflections on the parallels between Rome and the contemporary society as a means of understanding potential pitfalls and avoiding the mistakes of the past. Considers the role of superpowers like Rome and the United States in shaping global politics, economics, and culture. He explores really well, by the way, the challenges of and responsibilities that come with weighing immense power and influence in the world stage, as well as the potential consequences of mismanagement or overreach. You know, what we've done in the Middle East, kind of with Iran, and what we've done in South America, and you know, we just have to be more careful with those kind of things. So he gets in very much into details of that. And with that, I've got 10 minutes for questions. I've got a reading list. If you want to get to know where I got this information, essentially comes from these books that I have gone through over the last 3 months or so. I'll take questions. I don't have the microphone. Oh, we've got a question over here. And feel free to correct me. Again, it's 700 years of history. I might have made quite a bit of mistakes.
The only thing that struck me is when you mentioned the mass killings, hundreds of thousands of people. Well, how did they do that? How did they do that? Get rid of them?
You mean the war, or are you talking about prescriptions?
The politicians got rid of their...
Oh, no. Yeah, I mean, they chased, for example, Cicero, you know, and they used their military police, military personnel.
It said hundreds.
Hundreds,
yeah.
Thousands in the second triumvirate.
They didn't drop
Thousands.
a bomb or anything. How did they do that?
Swords apparently can cut quite swiftly.
Okay. Well, and I noticed the absence of, I'm not a feminist, but this is all male stuff.
I did say at the beginning that history is something that we're trying to change. I mean, it wasn't, till 1919 that we gave the women the right. We just had that talk here by Andy last week. So, yeah, history was never kind to women. Maybe like way back ancient Egypt, there was the closest to women in power. But even there, it was only the elites. Other question? Yes?
Ferki, I'm thinking about external forces. Okay, if I'm looking at Putin and the Russian intelligence services, and they're such experts in just informatia, and now they use social media as a pipeline to cause I would say a lot of dissension. I mean, they're feeding a lot of stuff into social media today that's affecting what's going on in the United States today. Mm-hmm. And just not the United States, but other Western European countries as well. But, I mean, this is a lot to chew that you just put out, but were external forces, did they have such an impact? I mean, of course they didn't have social media like we do today. I mean,
oh yeah. I mean, this is nothing new, folks. That's what Cicero was talking about. You got to spend money to educate your populace, your people, so that they don't fall prey to those kind of ideals. Civic education. I've done my own research. There's about 3,000 civic deserts in the United States where things that are happening here at the Jefferson don't happen. People don't talk. They go to college, they get a degree, and essentially everything after that is left to the individual. And when that happens, you know who provides the civic education? Politicians. We can't leave civic education on the hands of politicians. That's what happens. You know, that's what happens with Caesar. So I would say we're not going to be able to put the genie back in the bottle when it comes to social media. We can prevent, you know, my thing is like, we have borders in real life. Why can't we have borders on social media? But people don't like that answer, you know. But no, that was a continuous thing. You had each republic would send people in, and they influenced the people of Rome. And who could make the trip from some of these distant places in Rome? It was the wealthy. So there was a lot of that going on, even back then, of the wealthy of this republic or this colony influencing what was happening in day-to-day life in Rome. So, yeah, sorry. I don't think it's anything new. We just have to do a better job of educating people that, you know, hey, folks, we fought 2 world wars and a revolutionary war against dictatorship. We have to refresh that kind of history. And fascism. We have to refresh that memory, that kind of stuff in the minds of American people. We have one more question here?
No, I guess.
Oh, no, we need the mic.
I just wondered whether, how you feel about democracy on the decline here. How do you feel about that? Are you drawing a parallel here?
No, not really. I don't think we are there yet. I do see a couple of issues, the divide, the cultural divide that has happened. I don't know if this whole idea of a dictator for a day, that sounds to me like something that Caesar would approach. In a day, using the vast military power of the United States, you can do a lot of damage. So I am concerned of that. But we do have state powers. We do have our system of governance is even more spread out than it ever was in the Roman Empire. We have local elections. We have state elections. Everybody is an egomaniac, and they're not going to bow down to one person. Chances are. And usually, in what I know from reading about how dictators come to life, you need about 75 to 85% of popularity. I mean, we can't even get to 50%. So that's actually a good thing. I like the division. Yes?
I'd like to set things out perhaps a little bit more detail. For a democracy to survive, it has to have institutions well in place. Those institutions would have to define everyone's responsibilities to their government and the responsibility of the government to individuals very clearly. Mm-hmm. And we keep saying no one's above the law. That means there's something above everybody else, such as the Constitution mm-hmm. and the constitutional courts. And if we can start ignoring or overturning constitutional law at will because mm-hmm. somebody happens to be over 75% popular, and we're seeing those kinds of contemporary mm-hmm. leaders emerging in other countries that have that kind of popularity, yeah. and they are the new despots or dictators, and they have a constitution which they can easily ignore at will, and nobody says boo. And that's the beginning of the end, so to speak. And as you said, I agree. We have to educate people at a very young age what we used to call citizenship. Mm-hmm. It's a subject that needs to be taught as we raise new generations so that they won't lose sight of these mechanisms mm-hmm. that could turn a republic into a dictatorship.
Right. Yes. No, I see where you're getting at, and I agree with you. I don't think everybody sort of points out to the Supreme Court, right? And Roe v. Wade and all of that stuff. They, like it or not, that is part of the process of how they got to that point. You know, Ruth Bader Ginsburg didn't have to stay in office past 2012. She chose to. That's how democracy, that's how republics work. So you can't, you know, just...
Question.
Mm-hmm.
What is the difference between a republic and a democracy?
Well, a republic means the public thing, out of Latin words, the public thing. It's essentially a representative democracy. So it's only in the details. In a republic, you will find mostly, appointees like our Supreme Court. That's done indirectly. You don't have every voting position is not, or every position is not decided by direct vote. And, you know, direct democracies are not very good, historically. You have the 51% deciding that they want to kill the 49%. So you need what's known as concurrent democracy, democracy over time. Which is what a republic is supposed to be. I was part of a democracy in Yugoslavia. Milosevic was democratically elected. But there was nobody challenging that power. So he decided that he had no use for the rest of us. So I am not a scholar in political thought. Maybe Tom can help us with that. But essentially, that's my understanding, is that a republic has both elected directly and indirectly people. And there's much more of a separation of powers in a republic than a true democracy. Now, the two have joined. You know, if you would have asked this question 250 years ago, when our Constitution was written, Benjamin Franklin said, "We have created a republic, if we can keep it." Democracy was known as the Athenian democracy. You had 501 people in one building, and whoever gets in one side gets their way. So that's the way I understand it. The two have mixed, so now republic means democracy, democracy means republic. Most people think we live in a democracy. I can't tell the difference nowadays. I'm really confused about that question. I need some mentoring. Tom, maybe you can help me out with this. Andy, Tom, you've got an answer to that? Democracy and republic? See, I have my mentors who can help out when I get stuck.
Well, the American founders would not have said they founded a democracy.
Right.
Because they actually didn't believe in democracy. Because democracy means everyone has a vote. Well, no. Whoever gets to be declared a citizen has a vote. And as Ferki said in the Athenian, in Athens, that was white males. Well, all the males. No, they weren't all white. That was it. There was a certain elite group of males, and that was it. And so you could say all of the citizens have a vote, but when you have 330 million people, there's no way to have a constant plebiscite. So the founders created a republic, and you did a pretty good job of explaining it. It's a mixed system of direct election and indirect election and appointment, and that kind of leavens it.
Well, the Electoral College is an example of what the founders really were afraid of, which is particularly Jefferson. If I am getting this right, you can correct me. Jefferson was afraid of becoming modern Rome. So direct democracy was basically a fear at that point that America would be run by the coastal cities. So if you just do pure democracy and not assign weight, the middle of America would cease to exist, is the way I understand the Electoral College part of it. So that you don't have, and right now, you know, if you look at the left, it kind of would benefit them to have California popular vote. You know, you've got plus 5 million votes in California. But that's not how our system works. It's a republic through the Electoral College. I think the biggest differential between popular vote and electoral votes was not between Trump and Biden or Hillary and Biden. It was between John Quincy Adams and Jackson. Right? So, you know, popular majority tyranny was a real concern to the founders. In majority tyranny, things like theocracies can happen really quickly. You know, when you have all people agree, we're going to do this. I don't know how I feel about that. We should slow it down a little bit. And majority tyrannies in democracies can be very much a heat of the moment, kind of making hasty decisions and doing a lot of damage. I prefer republics. Yes? All right. Well, thank you. We've been going a little bit over time. Thank you. Have a good one.